Okay, could we have your name and age, please, if you don't mind?
Well, I'm Chuck Rymers. My age is 83, and I grew up in Elmore. I went to school here, and then later I came back and coached and taught school here. So I'm quite acquainted with the Elmore area, and my family has been a part of Elmore for many, many years, which I'll go into a little later. I'm a relative of Ezekiel Rice, who was a forefather of the town, and I had a grandfather that fought in the Civil War, came back and became a florist, and I was going through Grace Lupke's book, and I noticed that the first graduation of Elmore School, he furnished flowers for the graduation class. My dad was in the class that of 1889, which had a militia class. And a friend of mine found a reference in a magazine, or a old Elmore Tribune, that my dad had been elected captain of that militia. And of course, in 1889, the War of Cuba was taking place, and possibly if it would have gone on longer, the militia plus my dad would have been involved in that, but the war ended. That's kind of a background of what our family, but before I get into the history of sports, there's something that's bothered me, and I'd like to pass it on, because if we don't do it, people will forget in the future. And it's part of why making this speech was rather difficult, because I wanted to find information which has been lost. And it was like a tornado hitting the school, although people don't understand it. My grandson taught school at Lake High School, and much of the pictures and other information was blown away. Well, in a sense, the same thing happened to Elmore, and it was because of the consolidation that occurred when Elmore joined with Woodville. I was involved at that time teaching school, and I know the background, which is involved with sports. We had a choice of joining with Oak Harbor or joining with Woodville. And at that time, the basketball courts were discussed. Oak Harbor had a pretty crummy basketball court. It was on a stage and small. Elmore had a small basketball court. And the question was, if we consolidate with Oak Harbor, we'll have to play our games either at Elmore or at Oak Harbor. But if we consolidate with Woodville, they have a beautiful basketball court, and there wouldn't be any problem with our teams. However, because we didn't join with Oak Harbor, we delayed getting a new building. In fact, we never did get a separate building. It became part of the Elmore building, which probably wasn't very happy, made Woodville people not very happy. But the problem that I saw was that because we were going to come into Elmore, we had to get rid of the school pictures, the athletic yearbooks, and anything that pertained to Elmore, because we were going to become Woodmore. And they didn't want the kids that were going to join with Woodville thinking about their school. So much of this information was taken to the bus garage and stored. And it probably could have been recovered, but someone along the line thought, what is all this debris, this junk in the stored in the bus garage? Let's get rid of it. So they brought in a dumpster and got rid of it. What was kept through the efforts of Gene Contact and a few others were some trophies and some pictures which were stored here at the library, and this was good. At the time that I coached, a man from had been discharged from the Army, and he had been a Air Force photographer. His name was Louis Holland, and he took it upon himself to photograph all of our tournament basketball games. Then he spliced all of them together, labeled them, and put them on a large tape. And I had that at home, fortunately, and later a young man by the name of Dave Marsh, a brother of one of my players, was a weatherman at a TV station in Kissimmee, Florida. And he found out that I had this tape, and he asked me if he could have it to make small tapes and send them to all of the members of my team, plus myself, and one was sent to the library here. Otherwise, if I would have turned in that film, it would have been lost like everything else. It seems that once the two schools merged, and through the years everything was going fine, except my son, Tom, was a freshman on the 1968 basketball team here at here at Elmore, and he was good enough to make the varsity and scored 45 points. Well, the next year Woodmore was formed, and he played 3 more years for Woodmore, and he accumulated points. In fact, he had 1,000 points, which was amazing. About, maybe 5 years later, Jeff Haar, who later went on to University of Toledo and played basketball, had reached his senior year, and he had gotten 1,000 points. Well, it appeared in the school newspaper that he was the first 1,000-point player. And when we read that, we thought, well, this is certainly not right, because my son Tom was the first 1,000-point player. So we called the school to find out what was going on. They said, well, because he had played his freshman year and got 45 points, he wasn't eligible for that 1,000-point award. And this was an indication that Elmore had no bearing anymore on sports. We checked with the athletic director, who went through and got all the scorebooks of Tom at Woodmore, and we found he had over the number of points to get his 1,000-point award, even without the 45 from the Elmore. Well, Jeff Haar broke my son's scoring record. My son had a 42-point record. Jeff's was higher. And the principal at Woodmore called and wanted Tom to go into a ceremony on the floor and present the ball to Jeff Haar, and Tom refused. He said, "Hey, if that Woodmore can't remember that I was the 1,000-point winner, then I don't feel obligated to do this." Maybe it was the wrong thing that he did, but this bothered me as well as Tom through the years, that just because you went to Elmore High School, you would be jeopardized in your future. I sometimes feel that maybe we should have been like, gone the route of Bettsville and remained independent. But you can't fight the trend, and it was all consolidation to save money, I guess. Okay, now I would like to go into the program that I had set up. First, the early schools. My dad always told that the first school was a log cabin which was located outside of Elmore on Route 105, where the Rymers Cemetery is located now. And later, according to Grace's book, it was moved to Elmore, and eventually a two-story brick building was built opposite the depot. And that is where all my brothers and sisters went to school. It was torn down in 1931 when the new school was built at the present site. There was no basketball court located at that school. And it's interesting in Grace's book that in 1912 they purchased new playground equipment, and they installed 2 posts for the basketball court. And it said that in the article from a paper that they expect a team ready for business soon. Well, that leads to a point. If there was no basketball court, and they certainly couldn't have played outside in the wintertime, then where did they play their games? Well, there is an opera house, and it's located in one of the stores on Main Street. It was falling to disrepair, but one of the men from Elmore that owns that building fixed it up, and you can still see it today. But it had a stage at one side, a floor, and a raised seats section. The problem was, in playing basketball on that floor, was that there were supports for the ceiling that were placed periodically around the court. Now, if you know much about basketball, when you play man for man, you try to brush your man off on another player. In other words, they call it a pick. Well, teams that would come to Elmore to play our team would get picked by these supports. And if you ran into one of those sports, you got knocked down and possibly hurt. But that was the problem that other teams faced when they played on that court. Well, I have a feeling that even though we had no basketball court at the school, our teams were playing their games on that court, the Opera House court. In reading over the Grace's book, I noticed that the teachers were only hired for 3 months at the most. Some only 1 month, and then they'd check them out and determine if they were good enough to go the other few months. Well, at that rate, there would never be enough players to carry on these games in the spring or in the fall, because the young men and women were helping on the farm. So sports in high school didn't really get started until the 20s. I had a brother who played basketball. His name was Richard Rymers, and he evidently was good enough to make the Ohio State basketball team. And at his death, Kirk Lucky, who had played on the same high school team, told me that my brother Richard had made the Ohio State team and had gone to UCLA and USC and played basketball against them. My sister Florence Rymers was also on a team that was very good. In fact, Florence Peterson was about 6 foot tall, and she played on that same team. I was going through a book here at the library, and I see Florence Peterson was an assistant coach later on teams after she graduated. I didn't run across Florence Peterson until I left Elmore and ended up at Macomber High School. Well, Macomber is an all-boys school, and it's associated with Whitney High School, which is all girls. And the principal at that time was Florence Peterson. And it's rather ironic that our paths crossed. There were a number of adult basketball teams from Elmore. We had some baseball teams and basketball teams. There was one called the Outlaws, and they played at the Opera House, possibly charging admission, which would make them semi-professional. But the one that I was interested in is a man called Saki Wainwright. Now, he was a softball pitcher, and he was so famous that he was on a team that traveled around the country and had a no-loss record for many years. I was going through Grace's book, and she has as the first graduating class a woman by the name of Wainwright, and I wondered if that might have been his mother. Saki Wainwright's hobby was making bats. In other words, he had a lathe and he'd run off these bats and then put his name on them, a Saki Wainwright bat. And all the kids at that time wanted one of those bats. He would sell them to the kids, or sometimes he would give them one. But he was quite a remarkable person, and he passed on, and I'm sure that people feel that he was carried a very important part in our community. There was another team that played here, and my brother Jimmy played on that team. He was, I'm ahead of myself. Richard, my other brother, was graduated in 1926. Or no, I'm sorry, Jimmy graduated in about 1931, and he, it was during the war years, or no, I'm sorry, the Depression years, and no one had enough money to go on to college. In fact, my brother Jimmy was going to, was trying to get into Annapolis, and unfortunately he couldn't pass his math tests, and he failed his chance. We often say, well, he's probably living today because that was most of those young men that went to Annapolis ended up in World War II on a PT or on a destroyer or battleship, and possibly would have sunk and been killed. But my brother did get a job. He was the only one to be hired by the Sun Oil Company, and they hired him because he was such a good basketball player that he would play for their team. And at that time, very few young men could go on to college, so it was like a college teams being sponsored by the factories where they worked. My brother's coach was Paid Koontz, Cootnz. He had a son called Bill Koontz, who later became coach at Clay High School. And Bill's had such a good reputation and was such a hard worker at Clay that they named the recreation center after him. There was a team that I should mention. It was the Elmore team that went to Ohio State basketball tournament. I was a 7th grader at the time, and I was impressionable, and all of those young men were my heroes, including the coach. The coach was Al Turner, and I have something personal about him. I was on his 7th grade basketball team, and he told my dad that I should get a corn cob and put some turpentine on it, and my dad would know what to do with it, because he says, "You're not running fast enough." So I was so naive, I went home and said, "Dad, the coach wants me to take a corn cob and put turpentine on it, and you tell me what to do with it." Well, my dad laughed, and fortunately he didn't do that, because as the years went by, I was able to run faster and faster. But I remember sitting on the stage watching these boys play ball. They were so good, and some of the members were Jack Mills, Bob Schroeder, Morton Hanneman, and Don Roberts, Carl Sonicson, Paul Carson, and Jack Welch. Now, some of these men didn't make it through World War II. In fact, Jack Welch was on a ship that was hit by a torpedo, and he was killed. The others were my heroes, because I wanted to be a basketball player too. And it came to my high school basketball team. I was coached by L.R. Hetrick, who at that time was about everything. He was the principal, he was the industrial arts teacher, and that was because during the war you couldn't get teachers that could last through the year. They were mostly taken into the service, and so my year was made up of teachers that were coming or leaving school. In fact, one of my classes had 3 different teachers, but Mr. Hetrick was our coach of basketball, and some of the players on my team were Bill Hetrick, Bob Schuster, Don Brooks, Gordon Sloan, Bob Pauley, Earl Avers, and the last 2, Bob Pauley and Earl Avers, are still here in the community. Our team used a 2-3 zone, and the reason for that was the small courts we played on. Big courts, you had to play man for man because a zone left too many openings. We always had a 4-team county tournament made up of Genoa, Lakeside, Oak Harbor, and Elmore. Port Clinton was in our area, or our county, but they were too large. They were in a larger classification. We were interested in Wood County because they had such a big, so many schools that they had to start 2 weeks before our Ottawa County tournament, and they would eventually get down to 4 teams, which would advance to the sectional. Well, we got into the same sectional. They were played over at Fremont, on the Fremont basketball court, which was much larger than most of the courts in the area. And we were so happy that year, our senior year, because we had knocked off some very good teams around the area. St. Mary's had a perfect record until we played them. We, however, got to the semifinals of the tournament. We ran up against a little team called Signet from Wood County, and I got in foul trouble. at that time, you were only allowed 4 fouls. And then, in other words, once you got your 4th foul, you were out. Well, I got in foul trouble, sat on the bench through the first half, and then fouled out in about the 3rd quarter. We didn't do too bad, but we lost by 2 points, and that was the end of our year. But we had track, and I recall as a little 7th grader, my job was to shovel the high jump pit and the broad jump pit and get them ready for the track season. And I saw all these maggots in the sawdust as we turn it over, and I said to myself, when I get in high school, I'm not going out for high jump or broad jump because I don't want to jump into those maggots. However, I did run the mile, and our field was what you call an 1/8 of a mile track. That meant you had to go 8 times around the track in order to form a mile. And it was practically all curves, so you would be running on 1 foot, making those curves. I didn't do too well. I got a 3rd place in the mile, but it wasn't really my sport. I went on to college, and I was fortunate to be able to come back to Elmore and become a basketball coach and science teacher under my former coach, Lamar Hetrick. And I was fortunate to have some very good teams. I felt that Mr. Hetrick had groomed me in the coaching field because we used the same 2-3 zone, and I had pretty successful records because at that time there were very few large gyms, so our zone defense certainly was effective on the big or small courts. I came to Elmore a year after football had started, and the coach at that time was Jim Smith. Well, Jim had played football at Green Springs, but only 6-man football. And we had 11-man football here at Elmore. But he had made the adjustment in his coaching techniques, and he was a very good coach. A little bit about Jim's war record. He had been a commander on a PT boat, like Jack Kennedy, the president, and he had a lot of stories to tell of picking up wounded or air pilots that had missed the carriers and landed in the water, and they'd have to go out and pick them up, and they were not pretty sights. But Jim left after a few years at Elmore, and at that point we hired a different football coach, and I got the basketball coaching job. I remember back when Jim Smith was coach, he went to the Cleveland Browns and bought, or I guess they gave him, brown jerseys, and he used them for practices. And that was certainly a recruiting, effective recruiting thing, because all you had to tell the new recruit was, you'll get a chance to wear a Cleveland Browns jersey in practice. When Jim was the coach, they ran up a score. Well, I don't think they really did, but Genoa had such a poor team that Elmore ran up a score of 92, and it angered the coach over at Genoa. So later, when Elmore didn't have as good a team, they would run up scores on Elmore like they felt Elmore had run up on them. In other words, Elmore paid the price for many years for what Jim Smith had done or possibly didn't do. When I took over as basketball coach, I paid my dues. I bought a lot of basketball books and read them. And, I used the zone defense that Mr. Hetrick had used. And I finally reached my best year, which was 1959. And I had some very good team players. Lyle Haar, that I mentioned earlier, was the father of Jeff Haar, who was one of the best ball players that Elmore ever turned out. Harold Simrock was one of the players. John Marsh, who was later became a worker at the White House. He was in charge of the furnace and department. Bob Weber, I still see him. He's a farmer in this area. Tom Schaefer, Dale Klingbeil, and the best player I ever had was Barrett Bates, who had moved here from Kentucky. His father was a minister, and Barrett Bates was well groomed in fundamentals of basketball. He had had a coach that had played at the University of Kentucky. When I was coaching, I had some interesting opponents. One was Bill Hetrick, who I had played basketball with in high school, that was coaching at Woodville. And he was very successful over there. And another was Frenchie Falaire, who was a coach at Lucky, Ohio. And there was an interesting thing that took place my basketball year. There was a man called Will Collins, who was Frenchie Falaire's assistant coach. And because they were going to play us, and we had Barrett Bates that was such a good player, Will Collins told me that he had to pretend that he was Barrett Bates through the practices. And Frenchie Falaire, who had won many games and had a lot of tournament successes, had told Will Collins that they were going to beat us. And Will Collins said they played against our Elmore team and were beaten anyway. Will Collins later moved to Toledo and became the head basketball coach at Rogers High School. When I left Elmore, I eventually ended up at Rogers High School, and here was this man, Will Collins. And Will would say, "Chuck, why don't you pretend that you're one of the players that we have to play against?" So after school, I would go down and pretend I was one of his opponents, and I had to mimic him, but it was enjoyable, and I had a very good time. Well, that kind of, I've reached my end of this kind of thumbnail sketch of the Elmore basketball programs. I probably could have mentioned a lot of other things, but I think this is sufficient for now. Thank you.
Would you like to give us any information on some of the businesses that you remember as a young person in the town? Or do you have any stories about some of the events like homecomings or?
Well, my family has been here at Elmore for many, many years. As you can see from what I said about my brothers and sisters, I was the last one in the family, and many of these things were passed down to me from my sisters and my mother and my father. I remember the buildings that are now gone. We had a blacksmith shop across from us here at the library, and farmers used to bring their horses in to be shoed, as they said, or horseshoes put on their hooves. We had another shop, machine shop, located near the the firehouse, and that both of these buildings were torn down. But at that time, it was very important to have machinery to be built for the farmers and repairs. And most of the farmers had horses at that time. Very few had tractors. But this, as the years went by, the need for shoeing horses became obsolete, and eventually these buildings were torn down. Now most farmers do their own repairs, and most of their equipment doesn't break down right away. I have enjoyed living in this area all my life. I had opportunities to move. I know we discussed moving into Toledo when I first got a job there. I taught at Woodward for 4 years, and then at Macumber for 3, and spent the rest of the time at Rogers High School. And I commuted all the time, which was quite a drag, but I enjoyed it to live here in Elmore and keep up with the local teams. All of my children went to Woodmore High School and were successful. My son Tom moved to Genoa, where his children played sports, and I was able to watch them play. And I used to tell my son, it's awful hard after playing basketball against the Genoa Comets to go and cheer for the Genoa Comets while my grandchildren played in sports. But I'll never regret it. Right now we have a granddaughter who is playing for, who will eventually play for the Lake High School team. Of course, Lake is having problems getting their new building put up. And I hope that she'll be successful. My grandson teaches there, David Rymers, and he teaches math and coaches. And he's got a little boy and a little, 2 daughters. And I'm sure that as long as I'm around, I'll be going to watch them play as in sports.
I wouldn't mind asking you one more question. Where did you grow up? Was it near the cemetery, the family cemetery?
Yeah, in the farm home at the
Okay.
cemetery.
Okay. And I don't know, maybe I missed it, but did you mention that the early descendants were actually buried in that cemetery?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most families had their own burial plots, and we had the plot, which is located on 105, and all our relatives were there, and it became a problem keeping the grass cut and so forth. So when Elmore organized a maintenance department for the cemeteries, we hoped to have them take care of it. And it was quite a surprise a few years ago to find out that the deed for that cemetery was never transferred over to the town of Elmore. In fact, it was still owned by our family. And however, the town still maintains it. But most of the relatives of our family are buried there. In fact, Ezekiel Rice, that started Elmore, has his grave there along with his brothers. I will probably be placed in a grave in the same line of graves that are there. We didn't want to be pretentious. I guess that was the reason that my mom and dad wanted to have the gravestones the same for all the members of the family. So we have a string of gravestones, no different than the others. And I always feel that that's good. My grave will probably be at the one end of the string, and I hope, I'm not looking forward to it, but I'm looking forward to having my grave there.
Sure.
Not to pass on. My grandfather was 88 years old when he passed. I'm 83, or 83. I feel no different than I did when I was a kid in high school, which makes me feel good. I've tried to keep active and followed the sports of my grandchildren, and now I'm into the great-grandchildren, and that keeps you young. I hope it'll go on for as long as possible.
And so do we. And so do we.
Well,
And thank you. Thank you
okay.
very much. We're going to put this back on because we want to catch the explanation of the area where the cemetery is.
Well, the cemetery is located at the corner of our farm, and this was what we call the Rymers Cemetery, because in those days, each family more or less had a burial spot. And I know all of my relatives are buried there. In fact, Ezekiel Rice, who was who more or less began Elmore, is buried there along with his brother and two brothers. The cemetery was once a Indian mound. In fact, the Indian mound, according to my mother and dad's description, traveled along the river and went across the road into the neighbor's garden, swung around, and came back to where the cemetery is located. And there's two stories that I've heard. One is that it might have been a fortification built up as a temporary fort for the men that were traveling from, let's say, Port Clinton to Fort Meigs during the War of 1812. In fact, when my brother dug his foundation for his house, which is on the corner by the cemetery, we found black burial or fire pits located every 20 feet on the side of his excavation, which might have meant that there were tents located at that spot, and these were the tents or for the men that were staying at this fort. Now, the other explanation or theory is that those mounds were Indian-based. There have been Indian mounds located along the portage. In fact, down near Port Clinton are some, and of course along the Maumee there's many. And my mom used to tell about living, or that we had an ancestor that lived in a log cabin along the river, and Indians would come up on their canoes and stop at her back door and want a handout. And she said that they warned her not to go up on the hill where that so-called fort was located, because their ancestors lived there. She always made the Indians a little food handout, and because they felt that she was encroaching on their land. And unfortunately, the Indians eventually were moved out of this area because our men wanted to, or our ancestors wanted to have the control of it. And we don't have Indians around here anymore. I remember my brothers still remember the mounds going through the cemetery out there, and eventually the road took out the mounds. The neighbor's garden leveled them off, and they were kept a long time in the cemetery because there was no reason to level them off, but they're gone now. I think it would be interesting for someone to do an archaeology dig in that area, because they might be surprised what they could find. I know the neighbors down the road have found Indian burials sites. In fact, the neighbor man and I dug one ourselves. A woodchuck had brought up bones in the digging of his hole. And my friend, we were just young kids at the time, he says, "Hey, I think there might be a body underneath there." So we took our shovels and we started to dig, and we picked up the femur bone and the leg bones and a few parts of the skull, and we laid them on a board under a apple tree. And of course, being young, we forgot all about it. And one day I happened to remember, I wonder if those bones are still on that board under that apple tree. And I went down there, and here a few of them were still there, and I picked them up and I took them home and put them in a drawer in the house. And I always think, gee, what if that Indian would want to come back and get his burial straightened out, then here I have his bones. But there were burial sites all along the Portage River, and of course they've been lost now, because at one time no one really cared. But it's certainly, I'm hoping things will change and they'll preserve these places. I think our farm probably has more historical value or sites than most places in the area. I know there was when I was a kid, I'd play along the river, and there were stepping stones that would cross the river, and they even had a little path going up to the road on this side of the river. And my dad used to say, well, those are Indian steps, that the Indians would cross our farm and join the trail that was on the other side of the river. Well, we definitely know that the Route 105 was Indian trail, and eventually a wagon road, and then it became a automobile road, which it is today. But there are still places along the road where the early trails were located, and obviously the Indians had camps along those trails. My mother always told that along our farm was a Indian encampment, because there was a rock that had been hollowed out to act as a mortar, and they would use another rock as a pestle to grind their grain. And the river eventually broke the rock apart, and it was carried down and lost. But all along the river were campsites of the early Indians. And we've found so many arrowheads and tools that the Indians used to grind their grain, and axe heads, so that possibly our farm was a Indian site for many, many years. That cemetery that we have at the corner of our house, or corner of our farm, was once a spot where you could look down in one direction of the river, and you could also look up the other direction. This was not unusual for Indians to build their camps so that they could spot an enemy coming down the river in their canoes in two directions, and they could prepare for a fight. And so I think that cemetery and where those Indian mounds were located was a defensive spot for possibly Indians. It's unfortunate today that this history isn't recorded. I I know our family have some records of this, but so many of the family have passed on, so you can't talk to them anymore. Whatever they had in mind had to be written down, and many, although we haven't gotten rid of it, but a lot of families in moving will take records and dump them because they don't want the hassle of carrying boxes of paper. And this is unfortunate because much of this history is lost. Well, I think
I appreciate it. Thanks again.